Hello and welcome to Financial Express. I'm Shaleen with my colleague Zoya. We have with us Arjun Goswami, Director Public Policy at Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas. Arjun, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
India is assuming the presidency of G20 for the next 1 year. How significant is this for India?
It's hugely significant, but I think very significant, not just for India, it's significant really globally. We're at a time of deep conflict, Ukraine war, tensions between countries, and achieving a consensus across countries is a big challenge, as we've seen during the presidency of Indonesia, and now the baton passes to us, so we will have to navigate that.
What does India expect to get out of the presidency for the next 1 year? Economically, the benefits.
So I think India, is approaching this in the following ways. First of all, as a country that is already the fifth largest economy in the world, with aspirations to rising higher up the league table, it wants to make sure that the global economy recovery post-pandemic is not compromised through conflicts. That is in India's interest, but it's also in the global interest. I think India is also looking at this unselfishly, in terms of the contribution that it can make in underlying areas to try and give a support structure to that global impetus for growth. And there are several areas which I hope will be part of India's agenda to do that, areas where India has already demonstrated some significant track record and some significant effort, so they would come with some credibility, much like the credibility of the country on the global stage as a balancing force can be brought to bear. So those, I think, are the crucial issues.
You spoke about underlying areas. What are those areas that India can hope for?
So I would, of course, it's for the G20 Sherpa and the Indian government to articulate what its G20 areas of priority are going to be.
Yes.
But if you were asking me personally, I would hope that they look at three areas. First, in a global and domestic economy where the digital economy is becoming a bigger and bigger actor. The need for digital public goods to kind of act as the underlying support structure for connectivity between economies and financial flows between economies. That would be a very significant, area for India. Secondly, there are complicated areas which are arising as a result of fintech innovation. Some of those areas carry significant risk, and those risks have to be managed cross-border. So one of those areas would be related to crypto assets and how those should be managed in the most effective way possible. And the third area that I think would be sort of interesting for India to explore is how trade can really go through a stronger revival, like trade and investment.
Let's come to trade for a minute. How can that happen? How can can India gain more in terms of trade after this happens?
So I think the architecture of the trade system needs a couple of different parts. One, of course, is making sure that the WTO multilateral system continues to operate and function. Make sure that some of the things that have held back WTO are resolved, both in terms of mechanisms and agreements. But that really has to be supplemented by substantive trade agreements that don't necessarily depend on a lowest common denominator consensus across 186 countries. So having effective bilateral or plurilateral trade agreements which increase trade flows, which reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers between countries, could make a strong contribution as something complementary to the WTO system. And I think India's efforts in this regard could be very, very helpful and useful.
You spoke about crypto assets as well. The rules about international finance that govern our traditional international transactions.
Right.
Can't those same rules be applied to crypto?
So, at the moment, the problem that has occurred is that the crypto industry is not covered by those rules and regulations. The normal rules and regulations that cover traditional financial institutions, traditional banks, non-bank finance companies, etc. So we need to find a way in which that industry is properly regulated, and regulated in terms of use cases, regulated in terms of not just activity, and the different types of activity, ranging from the way crypto exchanges work to the way in which stable coins, for example, are operating, but also entity-based regulation. And the news has been full, as you know, in recent days with the collapse of FTX. So it is important that regulations are put in place, but this requires coordination across domestic financial sector regulators, and it requires coordination across international standard setting bodies. So it's a two-stage coordination effort, and if India can grasp that nettle and take that forward, I think that would be a big contribution.
Is it in the other countries' interest to move forward on that?
Yeah, I think with G20, it is in the end a consensus-driven policy coordination mechanism. So views at the moment in an area like crypto are quite divided. There are some countries like China that have outright banned it. There are some countries like El Salvador that are doubling down on Bitcoin, where they say that they will buy a Bitcoin every day, no matter what the collapse in value has been post FTX. So we are not at this point at a consensus point, but I think that if the recognition of risks backed by serious reports, which are usually issued at G20 from different standard setting bodies, is done, then at least it can help plot a forward path as to what we should do in this area. It's classically an area where since there is as yet no common position across countries, and no common position necessarily across standard setting bodies and regulators, G20 can make a contribution to at least having really serious technical reports that can set that pathway.
What about investments? After the U.S.-China trade war, there was a hope that a lot of manufacturing from China, or at least some of the manufacturing from China, would move to India.
Yeah.
Very little part of that has actually happened, whereas other manufacturing has moved to Vietnam, Thailand,
Yeah.
places like that. Manufacturing is in India's interest.
Yes.
Can India use the next 1 year of meetings and platforms to really move that manufacturing needle?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely Make in India and investment in India is a big part of the government's program, and rightly so. It will ultimately be important for employment alongside whatever may be done on the startup side. That employment engine needs to fire, and it requires manufacturing, it requires investment. I mean, I think that G20 is an opportunity for the country to showcase itself through the G20 meetings again. It's not that I think it hasn't been happening, but because there are so many events that will take place for G20, this is certainly a good opportunity, and we should use it to position, different sectors. There are some signs that there is interest in India. I think translating that promise into investments, if that can be accelerated through the G20 year, that would certainly, as you suggest, be a very good outcome.
What signs are there?
So I think the fact that different tech companies are looking at India. You're looking at automobiles also at India. You're seeing one important thing, I think, for this to work is that domestic industry sometimes needs to lead the way through a confidence signal. I think depending always on foreign investors to come in and take the first step, and just to give an indication of this, what we're seeing in the EV industry, I think, is, I would say, an example of this. So the fact that we're seeing domestic car manufacturers like Tata's, like Mahindra's, take serious first steps in that market, send that confidence signal, can be the start point of getting that motor rolling, and it means that there will then be confidence by foreign manufacturers that there is a supply chain, and they can come in and take advantage of those supply chains and make the market more competitive, which is great for consumers.
You spoke about EVs, so pivoting to greener energy and climate change, there's a lot of discussion about sustainability and decarbonization. How do you think India can induce change as a result of its presidency, both like domestically and internationally?
We're speaking in the aftermath of the challenging discussions at Sharm el Sheikh in COP27, and whilst I think efforts were made, and I think the fact that in principle approval of a funding mechanism is a good thing. We all know the struggle that went on at COP27. So I think if we go back to COP26 and Glasgow, and India's commitment for net zero by 2070, and all the other targets by 2030 that therefore have to come to fulfill that 2070 target. What is the implication of that? The implication of that is that many sectors will have to decarbonize. Those targets cannot be met simply by one sector alone. The energy sector and the renewable sector is a huge sector. And I think the fact that India has its International Solar Alliance with France and others is one significant step in that regard. But it can't be done by the energy sector alone. And I think transport is classically a sector that can decarbonize, should decarbonize, and it should decarbonize not just for reasons of climate change. It should decarbonize because for those of us who are living in Delhi NCR, our pollution levels should go down. So I think that commitment is there on the policy side. Translating that policy into action is something which India can take some steps on. I think there were some announcements at COP27 of garnering sort of money from multilateral institutions and others in that sector. I think showcasing projects that can move forward decarbonization in other sectors, and India showing that can be done, is the demonstration effect that's required.
Earlier, when we were speaking, you said that there are two views around G20. One is that it's a broken institution, and another one is it's very, very important. What's your take on that?
So, there are, of course, deep pessimists about G20 who say that its high water mark was in 2008 after the global financial crisis, because the world was at a point of global financial collapse post Lehman, etc. And it managed to pull back from the brink, and that was really sort of a big point for G20, that there was recognition globally that things couldn't be done by the G7 countries alone, that it had to be a G20 grouping. And that after that, there has been a slow decline, that really there hasn't been anything meaningful. Well, the other end of the spectrum, it just celebrates the fact that meetings take place. My view is somewhere in between. I mean, there are serious problems for G20. I don't think we should sweep those under the carpet and pretend those aren't there. We are in a very fractured world post the Ukraine conflicts and other tensions, and those inevitably impact G20. We've seen that at Bali, and no doubt India will have to face that. So there's no gainsaying that. But that's precisely why G20 is required. And I don't think everything should be about what goes into a formal communique or what gets done in a formal meeting. The fact that G20 leaders meet, the fact that G20 leaders meet on sidelines, the fact that delegations meet on sidelines, the fact that business communities interact with each other, itself creates the impetus for greater cooperation between countries. And I think the fact that communiques are going out with the words that this is not an era for war, well, we know from whom that language has been taken. That's been taken from our Prime Minister. So it suggests that India's balancing role is ideally suited to what G20 needs right now. It cannot succeed with a country that is a firm advocate of one camp or another. It needs a country that has a relationship all around and can make it work across those countries and across those parties, and has an economy that can be an engine room for genuine innovation and innovation-led growth across countries. That is why this presidency is so important, and why I think we should continue to remain hopeful about where G20 can go. It's all to play for, and I think this is not a T20 game. This is a series, and Indonesia has passed the bat to us. It's done it under very difficult circumstances. I think it's for us to now take the bat and really swing hard, because this is our moment.
What about the enforceability of the of the discussions, of the conversations that happen? Are there treaties signed at G20 meetings, or are these just consensus meetings? Everyone agrees on certain things and goes back, and that's it.
Yes, so G20 traditionally is not a sort of meeting with binding enforceable agreements. It is a consensus meeting. It's a policy coordination mechanism where countries have to voluntarily agree that certain cross-border issues impact them, and that they all individually are required to take certain actions to deal with those cross-border issues. In a post-pandemic world, that's something that we should all have recognized, but given conflicts, etc., it's difficult right now. So I would expect not to see treaties and agreements signed. Beyond the communique, I would expect that if this presidency is successful, as I certainly hope it is, that we start to see some actions at national level which follow through on the consensus which is reached at G20 on things that are common problems. And if that is done, then the G20 process can really work, because you can then have this back and forth where you have G20 trying to plot a forward path using technical reports and dialogue in order to do that. Countries then take action to actually help execute it, and then it comes back into the G20 process to see how much progress has been made, where progress has not been made, why has it not been made, and to try and improve on that. And I hope that India can kickstart that process.
So you spoke about a consensus between countries. However, many would say there's a bridge between the developed countries and the developing countries. India is set to represent the global south. What do you think India can do for these developing countries with its presidency that others couldn't?
India historically, going back, there's a sort of continuity in the way in which we approach things, which goes beyond changes of government. It goes to the consistency of our approach. And for many, many years since our independence, we have been believers and championed the Global South. And we've done it because we're part of the Global South ourselves, but we've done it also because developing countries, particularly smaller developing countries, are often the unintended victims of those larger problems and larger issues. So when we think of issues like climate change and huge tornadoes and floods, etc., and you think of what happens in small Pacific island developing states, that's one example. When we think of the impacts in terms of energy prices and food prices emerging out of the Ukraine crisis, that's another. So I think India is right to remind countries on all sides of this conflict to find a way to seek a settlement, so that these impacts on countries that have done nothing to deserve those adverse effects, that is mitigated. And they're entirely right to sort of bring attention to that, so that when countries say it's my way or the highway, that's not an approach that we would support, and which is why I think our External Affairs Minister in a very sharp response in Europe said, well, Europe's view is sometimes that Europe's problems are our problems and our problems are our problems. I mean, that can't be right? I mean, global problems is everybody's problem, and that's what G20 is about trying to resolve global issues and not allowing a regional conflict to kind of undermine global progress.
Sure, that sounds good, and those sharp responses at Global 4, those are also very good retorts for television bites. But eventually, what gets translated onto paper is what matters.
Yes.
As you said about drawing attention to the problems of smaller countries or even ourselves,
Yeah.
I would not like to think that the attention is not already there. People, the developed countries are also aware of those problems. But
Yeah.
what I am looking for is, what is it that from these G20 meetings over the next 1 year could come out which is in interest of these developing nations, which actually makes the lives of other countries also better? Is there something that we have to offer them? That this is what you stand to gain if you let us have our way.
Ultimately, I think if there is a global south that doesn't really want to be forced into a particular camp, India can help champion their cause. And if it is a large enough grouping, then both camps have to pay attention to it, because they need that, that support, right? If the focus moves towards tangible things that promote, financial flows, remittance flows, things which help manage new areas of risk, which smaller countries may suddenly take without, fully appreciating what that risk may mean to their country. I think those are significant contributions. Having, beyond financial flows, having trade flows increase. These are all tangible things which India can put at the center and at the heart of what gets done. And if countries who are in either camp can see value in cooperating with that, rather than trying to competitively position themselves against each other and fracture a global system, I think that is a huge forward step and a very tangible one for countries. So it's, when you say, well, what can really come back to India and to global South countries, that is what should come back to India and global South countries. The agenda of the global South should be seen as absolutely central for everybody. It's not just a matter of, the global South wanting something for itself. Ultimately, countries that are in these opposing camps should appreciate that there is a very big market out there. We are a very, very big part of that market. We are saying, pay attention to this. And so maybe countries will pay attention to it. And if they do that, then they will maybe step back from more extreme steps that would really further fracture and damage things, right?
We're talking about trade, and India is advocating for a multipolar world order. How do you think, apart from trade, it can use its presidency to further its agenda?
When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, an American scholar called Francis Fukuyama famously said, it's the end of history. Well, he was completely wrong, right? We now know that. So, we are in a multipolar world, and I think, therefore, particularly as we see changes in the economic growth of certain economies, what is necessary is that there is a friendly relationship between countries that have historically been in a dominant position and countries that are rising. And India, because it has certain credentials as a democratic country, and because it has pretty good relationships across the board, is in a good position to demonstrate how a rising country does not necessarily have to be seen as a threat by, for want of a better word, a traditional hegemon country, right? Now, if that can be modeled, then multipolarity will take place smoothly rather than be seen as a fight to the finish in a zero-sum game where if I am, the top dog in the league, anyone else who's coming up the league is seen as some kind of, terrible threat. And the reason why your question is so important is it takes me back in an arc to the beginning of what I was saying. We have conflict, we have fracture, we have India that is not siding with any party and has influence with many parties and is trying to say, pay attention to the needs of the global south. We don't want to be a pawn in this process. Fix this. Second, we are doing certain things ourselves as an economy to try and take forward things which are risky, things which are challenging. We are trying to expand our digital public goods. We think some of these can go cross-border. Look at this as a process where the global south itself can contribute to global welfare. And lastly, of course, we are a country that is moving up the ranks, but we don't pose a threat.
Right.
We are willing to work with all of you, and you should not see us as a threat. And if you recognize that, then multipolarity, in fact, far from being an undermining force, becomes a way in which you reinforce the global order, albeit in an entirely new way, with many countries contributing to the setting of rules and reducing that fracturing that I was talking about at the beginning.
Last question for me from me today. You use the phrase, if India's presidency is successful.
Yes.
What will be your parameters for success?
Oh, that's a very searching question. I'm tempted to kind of say, let's not set the bar too high. But I think if we are able to get to a situation where all the G20 countries really attend and they participate fully, and there is, some consensus on the needs of the global south as part of multipolarity, that would be one. In other words, centrality of the need of developing countries in the global south is put at the center of the agenda, and everybody signs on to that. If that happens, that's one big win. Tangibly, if digital public goods, if some of these new areas of financial risk management cross-border, and if trade can be given a further impetus through some consensus understandings, great. That would be sort of a bonus, if you like. So if they achieve the second, it's like through the roof, right? So that's my hope. That's my hope. And I think it's a very exciting time to be Indian. It's a very exciting year that's coming, I think, for India and for the world. I think it's a time when we should showcase ourselves, and that doesn't just mean the government, that means really all of us. I think that we should put our collective shoulder to the wheel, show that we're a country which is where the government has so obviously the government, they take the lead role, but where private sector, where media outlets, we're all part of a diverse country, and that in that diversity lies our unity. And if diversity is the source of our unity domestically, diversity should also be the source of unity globally.
We've got 1 year of 200 meetings to go. Hopefully, this is only the beginning of our conversations. We'll have more going forward as we go along.
Sure.
G20. Arjun Goswami, thank you so much for taking our time.
Pleasure. Thank you.